Over the years, fentanyl has become the dominant drug on the streets across Canada, taking thousands of lives. In recent months, it has also become one of the excuses used by US President Donald Trump in levying massive tariffs on Canadian exports south of the border. But how did it become what it is today? I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post reporter Tom Blackwell joins me to discuss the factors that led to fentanyl's explosion, how labs have sprung up across Canada, and our country's role in the global market. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Tom, we're talking right now on the eve of Donald Trump's threatened tariffs on Canadian imports, and one of the expressed reasons for these tariffs is the notion that Canada is importing the deadly drug fentanyl into the United States. And while Trump's concerns may be overblown, there's no disputing the effect that the drug has had on Canada. And you recently had a really extensive piece in the National Post talking about kind of the history of the drug and its effects and kind of the network that Canada plays a role in around the world. So I guess before we get started in some of the history, for people who kind of have a sense of what fentanyl is and, you hear about overdoses, what is the scale of the human toll been in Canada in the last decade?
Well, it has been, very extensive. And it's interesting to point out that this is a problem that, when you look worldwide, affects two countries, essentially, Canada and the United States. And it's been somewhat worse in the States, but pretty bad here in Canada. Since the federal government started keeping track of opioid deaths as a result of opioid drug overdoses in 2016, there have been 50,000 Canadians who have died. Now, not all of those have been from using fentanyl, but for the last few years, about 80% of the deaths have been related to fentanyl. So I think it's fair to say that the large majority of those 50,000 deaths have been, for over the last 10 years, have been related to using and overdosing from fentanyl.
Mm-hmm. And while many Canadians have heard of the drug through the headlines about overdoses, drug trafficking, and even Donald Trump's tariffs, it's not necessarily the kind of drug that is its own. It's not like heroin, which just has a life as a street level drug now. It hasn't been used as medicine in many, many decades. Like fentanyl itself is still widely used in the medical community. Like where did it first originate and how did it originate?
Yeah, it does have an interesting history, and partly because unlike most of the opioid drugs that we know of that people have used for various medical purposes, this one is completely synthetic. So it's not unlike heroin, unlike other sort of morphine related drugs, it's not derived from the opium taken from poppies. It's not a natural drug in any way. It's basically created in a lab by combining chemicals and creating new chemical compounds. So it's completely synthetic, but it has a similar biological effect as the sort of natural opium drugs. And basically, it was invented in 1960 by a Belgian pharmaceutical founder, Paul Janssen, who founded Janssen Pharmaceuticals, which people might have heard of. It's now part of Johnson and Johnson. And it was actually, interestingly, and sort of invented as what was thought to be a safer form of anesthetic. They were using natural opium drugs as anesthetics, and this was, for various reasons, this was thought to be a safer way to use the powers of opioids than the natural drugs. And then it sort of developed from there into being a pain drug, analgesic. Sort of by the 1990s, I guess, early 2000s, it was relatively commonly used in a patch form, initially for cancer patients, terminal cancer patients with severe pain. and then it sort of developed from there. And we can talk about that. But those are the origins of it.
Yeah, it is kind of strange that we're talking about something that's really potent and used in hospital settings as a way to manage extreme pain. How do we go from that application to it becoming this street level scourge that we know it as today? And I guess, when did it first appear as a choice for people who are looking to get high?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, that's an interesting question because it did appear as a drug of abuse fairly early on, but it seems like the problem that we have now is related to other factors that occurred sort of later on. But I remember as a health reporter, back in the early or mid to late aughts, doing stories about well, first of all, about some tragic cases where teenagers were prescribed the patch that had fentanyl in it, and it was just too powerful for them. This is a drug that's 50 times more powerful than heroin, and those teenagers died. And then Health Canada put out alerts about kids getting their parents pain patches, fentanyl patches, and using them to get a high and dying. And then a little bit later than that, sort of 2008, 2009, there were stories about street drug users who were getting hold of the pain patches, the prescription patches, and extracting the fentanyl from it and snorting or injecting it. So there was that, and that was a fairly sort of minor source of drug abuse, I guess you could say, at that time. But really, what sort of led to the problem we have today is, well, a couple of things. One is the very liberal, and I think what's considered today to be excessive prescribing of opioid drugs, sort of starting in the late 90s and continuing into the early 2000s. And that was related to partly marketing efforts especially by one pharmaceutical company, to convince doctors that opioids were safe, not just for those cancer patients, terminal cancer patients, but for people with chronic pain, or even people who've have severe pain after an operation or an injury like a broken leg. So suddenly, these drugs were being prescribed, really widely in Canada and the United States, and I remember looking at the stats back then, and it was amazing to see these two countries were, way exceeding every other country in the world in terms of their prescription of opioids. And so that led to also to widespread abuse of these drugs. There were people who had been prescribed them and then became addicted, and then started accessing drugs on the street. And there were other street drug users who were getting hold of various opioids that were diverted into the black market, onto the streets. And so that was the first sort of kind of opioid crisis, I guess you could say, where there was widespread abuse of these drugs. And then there was a change that occurred, sort of around, 2010, 2000 to 2015, which we can talk about, which led to the rise of fentanyl, I guess, as a drug of abuse and overdoses.
Yeah, because I remember there were talk of policy changes that kind of forced the reformulation of some of these prescription opioids that made them less lucrative on the black market, and also you also started seeing reports in the news. I remember headlines talking about that people who were buying what they thought was OxyContin on the street were buying fake OxyContin that had fentanyl as the main ingredient. Like, how did these policy changes open the door for fentanyl, and then even how did we go from kind of these fake oxy pills to just everyone is just buying fentanyl?
Yeah, basically, I mean, there a movement eventually developed to restrict the prescription of by doctors of opioids. Various things happened. Eventually guidelines for treating chronic pain changed, and there were As you mentioned, OxyContin's formulation was changed to make it more difficult to abuse. Drug plans started, stopping the coverage of drugs like OxyContin. Um, and so a number of things happened. And as a result of that, and I don't think this is widely known, but as a result of that, that sort of incredibly liberal prescribing of opioid drugs, including OxyContin, um, declined, fairly dramatically over a period of a few years, and basically, I think from about 2014 to 2019, the prescribing of those drugs decreased by, I think, by 50%, by half. So a very dramatic change that occurred in that period, and it meant that there was basically for people who were had become addicted on drugs prescribed to them and were still getting prescription or were still expecting to get those drugs prescribed to them, and also the diversion of prescription drugs onto the streets, that started to dry up. So there was basically, as one expert put it to me, sort of a supply shock as a result of that reduced prescribing. So there was kind of a void that was created in terms of people who had become addicted, getting access to the drugs they wanted, and so sort of into that void came fentanyl. And basically, this time though, it wasn't people extracting the drug from prescription patches, because that prescribing had reduced so much. So instead, it was basically suppliers in China sending this stuff to North America, either via Mexico or even directly. You could order it online, and have it mailed to you, essentially. And as one expert said to me, and I think this is sort of what you were referring to. Initially, it was done almost sort of in a clandestine way. People didn't know that they were getting fentanyl, but it was included in OxyContin pills, or other types of pills that people were abusing. Um, and as this expert was saying, once they started taking fentanyl, even if they didn't know that's what they were getting, that's what they were hooked on, and because it was more powerful, that's what their brain made them crave, essentially. So there was no sort of going back, and then sort of eventually, um, you know, uh, drug users, knew that they were getting fentanyl. There was no sort of doubt about that. But that's kind of how it started.
We'll be right back. Now, you mentioned China in all of this, and I'm curious because we know China as a repressive regime, and you'd think there'd be big crackdowns on drug trafficking and drug exporting. What's China's role in all of this? And is it that it's being manufactured there and shipped over here? Are they sending the ingredients here? And is the Chinese regime turning a blind eye to the external drug trafficking that's kind of being started on their shores?
Well, that's kind of a $64,000 question, and it's definitely, you can't help but wonder what's happening, because, as you said, it's a government that keeps very tight control over its people and its businesses. And in fact, yeah, I mean, originally it was finished fentanyl that was being exported essentially to North America, and that lasted for a few years, and Canada and the United States, put a lot of pressure on China to curtail that, and eventually they did. In 2019, they imposed new regulations that essentially dried up the supply of finished fentanyl to North America, to the cartels in Mexico that were supplying the United States, to to criminals in Canada that were supplying the market here. But what didn't stop, and this sort of leads to the next chapter in the story. What didn't stop is the supply of the so-called precursor chemicals, the chemicals that could be used to make fentanyl here, in Mexico or here in Canada. And although some of those chemicals have been their export has been restricted by China to date, I believe that most of them have not been and continue to flow into Canada. Now, and to be fair, some of those precursor chemicals are ones that are used by other industries, and not just for fentanyl. But I mean, what Canada has done is they call it scheduling it. They put it on uh, a list of drugs that legitimate users of those, sorry, a list of chemicals that legitimate users of the chemicals have to get special permits to import. Um, so presumably, if China did the same thing at the other end, that would curb the export of them. But in most cases, it has not done that.
So is that what led to domestic production in Canada taking off? And you touch on one of them in your piece. It's these large labs that have been cropping up. I in many different provinces as well. Is that what led to it? And what are we seeing in terms of these labs in Canada?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely what led to it. That was sort of the most recent, I guess, turning point in this whole saga is the China's decision to basically stop the export of finished fentanyl, but not the precursor chemicals. So yeah, so suddenly, in order to sort of fill that void, we had in Canada we had criminal groups here deciding to make fentanyl themselves, and I think initially it was mostly the labs that they set up were mostly in houses. Uh, these are very volatile, dangerous chemicals, so that in itself is kind of a scary thing. Houses, in the middle of nice suburbs, that kind of thing. And then more recently, they've set up these so-called super labs, and it's basically compounds that are located, in rural areas or in the midst of those woods or whatever, that are sort of, hard to find, where they can kind of operate sort of, more or less secretly or without drawing much attention. And these are fairly sophisticated operations, and they're, the ones that have been shut down, that have been found by the police and shut down. They found massive amounts of the precursor chemicals and also the waste products, which are themselves apparently very dangerous. Um, so they are producing a lot of fentanyl, basically.
And when you say a lot, I mean, it's in relative terms, I suppose, to other drugs. When you see large cocaine busts, we're talking about thousands of pounds. Like for a really big cocaine bust, they're huge amounts. The fact that fentanyl is so potent, I assume that it's lucrative because it can be moved in small quantities. And when you have a large lab that's producing what it's producing, that allows us to export more, perhaps. We've become an exporting country of fentanyl. Is that what's making it so lucrative? And where are we sending essentially what is poisoning people? Where are we sending these drugs?
Yeah, I mean, to answer your first question. I mean, yeah, definitely. One of the things that makes it attractive to crime groups is that, because it's so potent, fentanyl is so potent. Um, you know, Profitable amounts of it don't take up a lot of space. Essentially, I thought it was really interesting factoid that I learned in doing this story is that, basically the entire amount of fentanyl consumed by Americans in a year, and the United States, which is 10 times the size of Canada, that entire amount could be packed into one truck, essentially. So you compare that to you know the classic bricks of cocaine or heroin that you see in police seizures, and it gives you an idea of how easily it is to move to transport this drug compared to others. So in terms of, is it being exported, and where to? That seems to be a question that even the police who specialize in this are not really very clear on at this point. There have been some seizures in Australia, and I think it's believed that Canadians are Canadian crime groups, which had already been exporting methamphetamine to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, are also now sending fentanyl to those places. And like I said, there have been seizures in Australia. Now, in none of those countries is fentanyl yet, anyways, a big problem the way it is here. So it doesn't seem like there's huge quantities being sent to those places. And then there's the United States, and of course, we've all read the stats on how much of the drug has been seized by American authorities coming across the border from Canada, and it's pretty small. Certainly compared to what's coming in from Mexico, which is the main supplier to the United States. So it's unclear, really, whether significant amounts of Canadian-made fentanyl are ending up in the United States. It's interesting to note that the Mexican suppliers have a pretty significant price advantage. It's basically Canadian-made fentanyl certainly sells here for 10 or 20 times what you can buy the Mexican stuff for in the United States. So that would suggest that maybe it's not economically, it's not such a good sort of export market for the Canadian crime groups.
Hmm. What are the solutions here? Enforcement is only one piece, but obviously we need law enforcement involved in trying to track down these labs and crack down on them and lay charges against the traffickers. But how do we keep people from dying from this? Like, what is the solutions to address the fentanyl problem in Canada that people are proposing? We obviously have a fentanyl czar who's trying to get involved and deal with the export market to the United States, as small as it may be. But what other solutions are people posing?
Yeah, it's that kind of raises, I guess, what as I understand, has been sort of a perennial debate over drug abuse, and it's sort of basically, do we focus on the supply, i.e., the production and trafficking of these drugs, or do we focus on the demand, that is, the people who are hooked on them? And one expert I interviewed said, you know, if we focus on the supply, we're going to get nowhere. We'll close down one super lab and another one will pop up, or more more will pop up. And I think there's probably some truth to that. But on the other hand, if you are effective in going after the supply, you can at least sort of increase the cost to those crime groups, and then increase the price of the drug on the streets, and make it less appealing, I guess, more difficult to afford. But the other side, of course, is demand, and one obvious way to deal with that is through treatment of drug addiction. And there are arguments that we haven't sort of put enough resources into treatment. Um, and some of the other ideas include what's called safer supply, where basically clinics sort of give out a sort of a safer form of opioid drug, not fentanyl, a less potent form of opioid, that avoids, or that has less risk of overdosing, and obviously dying from overdosing. We also have, which have become quite controversial, the supervised injection sites, where people inject the drug in an environment where, if they do overdose, they can be resuscitated fairly quickly. Those are the type of things that are being looked at, and that are being done. I think it's safe to say there's a fair bit of debate about what is most effective and what will work. I mean, it seems like a fairly not completely intractable problem, but a very difficult problem to attack.
Well, I appreciate the story, Tom. It's, really detailed, really extensive. People can read it at nationalpost.com, and it's definitely an important issue that Canadians should be paying attention to. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Tom Blackwell. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.